Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Hello, welcome back. This is Ryder Richards. Okay, we're going to tackle the Parallax View today, and this is by Slavoj Žižek. Now, I kind of got really buried in this and maybe overcomplicated it, but I think we're at a level now where you'll get maybe a good run of it without it being too much. So first, let's start with this simple definition of the parallax view. Now, we're going to tie this all into various forms of the binary that we've been discussing, and this is all really part of a larger attempt to break free of the silly two-sided game that we find ourselves playing. Now, that's going to be in part one. Now, part two, we're going to move into Slavoj Žižek's use of the parallax in the book, The Parallax View, and we're going to be using examples of Lacan and Levi-Strauss. And we're going to start to really get an idea of how the text redeems us from the Hegelian Dialectic, which of course we need to really get into more fully some other day involving Kant and all this other stuff. And then towards the end, in part three, I'm going to give you two very straightforward examples. They're kind of poignant about how the parallax works in daily life, such as love and Guardians of the Galaxy. Part one. The parallax view, it's really all tied in with the perspective view and parallels, which seemingly converge. So a parallel that has two L's in it that run parallel to each other, while parallax ends with an X. So in the parallax view, the L's cross or converge, forming them into an X. Now, this is kind of where we get to talk about perspective. Now, perspective typically has the shape of an A or an upside down V, and that means you can sort of stand at one point, perhaps at the base of a triangle, and if you're looking out at a set of train tracks, well, if you're standing between them, they seem to converge. These are parallels. As they move into the horizon, they seem to touch each other. So we know that they appear to do this, but they don't really do it. So perspective is really an optical illusion of convergence. Now there's this gap, and this gap will always remain between the tracks. We know this, but it's important to really keep in mind when we consider ideas that cannot converge. There's some ideas that there's always going to be a gap between them, and any kind of synthesis of them is merely a philosophical or perspective illusion. Now, what's interesting about the parallax is that we actually take this convergence point, the object that we focus on at the center of something, this might be the center of the argument, and we look beyond it into the background. In astronomy, parallax is used to figure out where a planet or a satellite is located, and this is by gauging the stars in the background from multiple viewing points. So two distant observation stations, maybe a moon base and maybe a planet, well, they both can look towards another planet or, oh wait, what is that? Is that the Death Star? Yeah. And then to figure out where it's located and it's really its size, then the observation stations can gauge the positions of the stars in the background. And they can then triangulate the location and therefore the scale of the Death Star. So this is our X shape again with the Death Star in the center. Now, a simple example here is an experiment you can probably do right now, which is to hold out your hand with your thumb up in front of your face. And then you switch left eye to right eye. And you'll notice that your stereoscopic vision shifts the background from the right to the left. So the planet or your thumb, it somehow remains in the center of the X. But it also appears to be in a different position given the shifting background, which is, of course, our shifting point of view. Slavoj Žižek makes this kind of spatial orientation move quite often in his philosophy, which is to really sort of give us the shape of something, a geometric model, a perceptual model in which to understand a philosophical concept. So he does it in like Sex and the Failed Absolute with the idea of the Mobius strip. And we've done a whole episode on the shapes of antagonism, and Žižek plays with a lot of those ideas too. So this might be like how you circle around each other while, always remaining opposite, but your point of view can actually shift. It's also how you can reconverge with your enemy, and you can even flip from the interior to exterior along the way, just like a Mobius strip does. Now, this is a handy tool to use, and Žižek introduces the parallax view to reconsider Hegel's dialectic. Now, for simplicity, let's sort of define the dialectic here. This is two points of view about one subject that are logically argued. But the Hegelian dialectic is really about the process of achieving a synthesis, where you take two contradictory or antagonistic points of view and you sublate them into a third position. So this is kind of, it's considered overcoming, and this can be positioned as higher. So yeah, this sublation, it seems to overcome the two arguments or two positions that originally seemed irresolvable. Now, in a fundamental example, which of course Zizek would say only obfuscates dialectical materialism, you could say something like good and evil are in a battle against each other, and yet the concept of the yin-yang actually tries to put them into a dynamic order of balance, that is a oneness. Now, this is a little bit like the light and dark side of the Force between Skywalker and Vader, yet there's this higher understanding that light and dark, or good and evil, are merely points of view, which play out an oppositional game over time, right? And even opposition itself is necessary for life to remain dynamic. And so from here, we're in an enlightened position. So from this heightened perspective, we have now sublated or overcome the oppositional character below us. But of course, the problem is, good and evil continue to exist, and we really haven't escaped anything. We just created a new, third, higher position, and this allowed us to release the tension of the gap between these two, which does not actually solve the problem, and it should not relieve us of responsibility. So how do we proceed here? Well, classically, you just dialectic more. You sublate that new yin-yang enlightenment problem into another, even higher position, and suddenly we notice a trend here that we just keep spiraling upward, adding more positions. Now, Žižek points out this is kind of an incorrect or reduced understanding of Hegel's dialectic. And by using the parallax view, we can really see that that gap between the positions, just like the space between the railroad tracks, does not collapse everything. But instead, we realize that the subject itself, the center of our focus, has always had multiple observation points. Now, even before we realized it, this subject actually contained both contradictory points of view. So what this means is we do not actually need a new position higher up that's overcoming something, because that position was there all along, embedded within the subject. We're just now revealing it. And it's not only that, but the contradiction that we're actually seeing, this dark light kind of problem, this good evil, it's actually fundamental to the operation of the subject itself. Part 2. In Slavoj Žižek's book, The Parallax View, which I've only read a portion of it, he brings up this idea of short-circuiting. And it is actually, the short-circuiting is a series of books from MIT Press, so you can check it out. There's lots of them in there. One example of short-circuiting is to think of somebody like Marx and Engels. Now, they took this idea of the industrial economy of capital, which was all about money and utility, a cybernetic functioning system to make stuff, really, to grow itself. And this was creating a new group of laborers and owners. Now, they looked at this system and they applied a slightly different logic to it than other people were thinking about. So what they did is they short-circuited the singular reading of capitalism good, with kind of an alternate version, maybe capitalism bad, right? Which is, of course, antagonistic to the existing order. Now, there really doesn't seem to be much of a neutral or middle ground between these two positions. And this is very similar to Freud with, say, psychology or Nietzsche's philosophy. They both applied this idea of the unconscious libidinal economy as a primary source of motivation. Now, this was before anyone else was really doing it, but yeah, what happens is they short-circuit the primary accepted narrative and they offer us a new position from which to view it and argue about it, which in a way kind of deconstructs the old position. But in another way, it's merely an addition of knowledge to how to view the system or the ideology or the subject that we're actually in the middle of. And what's funny about this is maybe Freud and Nietzsche didn't so much just, come up with a new way of seeing something as much as point out something that already existed and articulated it for us. Now, okay, to make his point in a whole spectrum of arenas, Zizek in his book discusses Kant versus Hegel, Marxist historical dialecticism, can't say that word, versus material dialectics, which we should, of course, do a whole episode on. And he even discusses things like quantum wave particle phenomenon, and he even gets into neuroscience. And of course, he's a Lacanian scholar, so he covers a lot of that and kind of gets into the complex symbolic processes of desire and signifiers. And all of this runs throughout the entire text. Now, one of the concepts Zizek brings up is that these points really cannot converge. Within all these systems, they are antagonisms, and like the train tracks, there must always be a minimal gap between them in order to maintain what they are and their understanding. Now, if the position itself is based on opposition, to remove the opposition is actually to remove the position in an interesting way, right? You can't just overcome it, because oddly it has to still exist. So a way to think about this is maybe in a very, very kind of maybe dumb and simple manner, is that if you have two eyes and you reduce both to a single eye, well, you're all of a sudden a cyclops and you don't have any depth perception. Now, the second point of view is necessary for depth. So it's not really an antagonism from an aspect of a deeper understanding. It's only when we back down into each position, each eye, that our background view is reduced again to a singularity, and this is a flatness of motivation or understanding. Example 1, Lacan. Okay, today, yes, today, of course, when else? We're going to give a Lacan-based example because we've kind of been talking more and more about him lately. Now, this is a quote from the Parallax View. Materialism means that the reality I see is never whole, not because a large part of it eludes me, but because it contains a stain, a blind spot, which indicates my inclusion in it. Nowhere is this structure clearer than the case of Lacan's petit objet A, the object cause of desire. The same object can all of a sudden be transubstantiated into the object of my desire, which is just an ordinary object to you. It's, to me, the focus of my libidinal investment, and this shift is caused by some unfathomable X, je ne sais quoi, in the object which can never be pinned down to any of its particular properties. L'objet petit a is therefore close to the Kantian transcendental object, since it stands for the unknown X, the nominal core of the object beyond appearances. For what is in you more than yourself? L'objet petit a can thus be defined as a pure parallax object. That is not only that its contours change with the shift of the subject, it exists. Its presence can be discerned only when the landscape is viewed from a certain perspective. So more precisely, objet petit a is the very cause of the parallax gap, that unfathomable X which forever eludes a symbolic grasp, and thus causes the multiplicity of symbolic perspectives. The paradox here is a very precise one. It is at the very point of which a pure difference emerges, a difference which is no longer a difference between two positively existing objects, but a minimal difference which divides one and the same object from itself. That this difference, as such, immediately coincides with an unfathomable object. In contrast to a mere difference between objects, the pure difference is itself an object. Now, another name for the parallax gap is therefore minimal difference, a pure difference, which cannot be grounded in positive substantial properties. Example 2, the village map. Now, to ground some of these ideas a little bit more, because that can get dense, right? It's this idea that Zizek offers from Levi-Strauss, who discusses a village. And when asking the villagers to draw a diagram of the village, they all draw it as a circle. But of course, for one group of the village, a subgroup, they draw a circle within a circle, that is, concentric circles. Now, for another group, they draw the circle split in two by a dividing line. Now, here's the quote from the text. A member of the first subgroup, let's call it conservative corporatists, perceives the ground plan of the village as a ring of houses more or less symmetrically dispersed around the central temple, whereas a member of the second, the quote, revolutionary antagonistic subgroup, perceives his or her village as two distinct heaps of houses separated by invisible frontier. Now, the point Levi-Strauss wants to make is that this example should in no way entice us into cultural relativism, according to which the perception of social space depends on the observer's group belonging. The very splitting into two relative perceptions implies a hidden reference to a constant. Not the objective actual disposition of buildings, but a traumatic kernel, a fundamental antagonism the inhabitants of the village were unable to symbolize to account for. They were unable to internalize it, to come to terms with it, an imbalance in social relations that prevented the community from stabilizing itself into a harmonious whole. The two perceptions of the ground plan are simply two mutually exclusive endeavors to cope with this traumatic antagonism and to heal its wound via the imposition of a balanced symbolic structure. Part 3. Okay, those can, of course, be very difficult whenever you're just hearing them out loud instead of sort of parsing them through reading them. So I'm going to round this out with two short, small examples, and they're not nearly as dense as most of that kind of stuff Zizek is working through in his text. And then, of course, I'm going to offer some thoughts on this positioning problem of the parallax. Zizek talks about faith and love as parallax. He essentially says that, inspired by Kierkegaard, that you must take a leap. On the outside, all faith looks ridiculous. It looks insane and irrational. Yeah, but once you're inside of faith, once you have chosen to believe, all of a sudden the contradictory arguments all fall into place, making sense. And you can see how everything becomes answered. But of course, you cannot see this until you're in it, until you change your position. And it's the same with being in love. It doesn't make sense until you're in it. Now, this is one of those dramatic shifts of position between rationality and faith. Zizek says we cannot have only faith or only rationality, but there must always remain a gap between them. That is the parallax gap, the minimal distance. But in a very real way, it's going to change your outlook on the entire world as you jump from one position to the other. Now, another example by Julian de Medeiros. He brings up the Guardians of the Galaxy. Oh yeah, so finally some pop culture. Now in the third movie, there is a moment of parallax at the end, and he points this out. Like in the two previous movies, the character Groot can only say, "I am Groot." Now, as the audience, all we hear is "I am Groot" over and over again, yet the team members seem to be able to translate it into multiple phrases or meanings. Now, as an audience member, this is kind of humorous, but there's a lack of understanding we have of what's really going on here. Now, at the end of the third movie, Groot says something different. He says, "I love you guys." Now, what this implies is not that Groot has actually said something different, even though it seems to us like he has. It implies that we're finally able to understand him. As the audience, after going through 3 movies together and all the hardships, we're finally part of the family. And with our new faith and belief, an understanding comes over us in which we are in the circle and we can now understand "I am Groot" as "I love you guys." So, yeah, those are easier examples to kind of grasp, right? Now, the question here is, can we ever go back to not understanding now that really we've encountered this new position, or we have shifted positions? So how does the parallax view really play out for us? Now, when we look at something like history or capitalism or psychology, we have multiple ideas or frameworks to choose from, each subversively short-circuiting the other, but of course all somehow working to expose more understanding, expose the core, offer some sort of insights. And these insights, of course, correlate and survive with the times that we're in, our episteme or paradigm. And that's because they have a certain kind of resonance or descriptive power that society or culture is grasping onto. Now, we can, sort of given our predilection, choose between any of them to make competing points. We can choose sides. And yet, in understanding them and how they enrich and complicate the overarching subject, say our understanding of the self or capitalism or psychotherapy, we can really find ourselves paralyzed with choice overload. We're unable to make a decision because we can't choose the position from which to react. Our sensibility to see broadly, deeply, it doesn't really overcome so much as frees us. So instead of sublation, the parallax positions. It offers context. And all of this without overcoming, without needing an antithesis synthesis to come up with a new singular position. The parallax instead allows you to somehow stay at ground level, moving between ideas, that is, positions, without jumping to a superior stance that somehow diminishes the antagonistic tension within the symbolic structure itself. And perhaps, like understanding Groot, you cannot unknow a position. You'll always be able to translate it, to understand it, and to have empathy for it. And this, maybe, finally, is how the binary is dissolved. All right, thank you all for tuning into this episode. This concept, while it's not overly tricky, it's really widely applicable, and it sort of undermines a lot of big ideas, and it really kind of hung me up for a little while. I'm not exactly sure why, but I think it's partly because I started reading Zizek's books. The way that he writes and the level of complexity he gives to something, as well as just jumping from point to point to point, makes it very difficult to really parse things out or simplify it. Like at one point in the first chapter, he goes from Kant and all about transcendental noumena into a story about Hitler and the Nazis, into comedy and why something is funny. And then he transitions into Hegel, and somehow he embeds a reference to Lacan in there. And all this is within like 6 paragraphs. Now, toward the end, you kind of get an idea that you have understood or encountered something here. But when it comes to like highlighting a piece of it and pulling it out, it's very difficult. There's a kind of ping pong of concepts, and he's offering them up only to sort of turn around and undermine them again a little bit later as part of a more significant point. So the truth is here, I don't have really enough of a grounding in philosophy to even be approaching these subjects because I'm such an amateur. And yet I had to tell myself at some point, maybe that's precisely what makes this episode valuable to somebody. It might actually be my amateur position. So thank you again for listening, and as usual, please like, rate, review, and most importantly, tell a friend. This is Ryder Richards wishing you a merry life of insurmountable contradictions. Yeah, at least you'll never be bored.